Hi, this brief video tutorial is going to introduce some concepts about how to connect different words and phrases when you're doing research. So just to start with, let's pretend that this blue circle represents all of the books about cats, and the yellow circle represents all of the books about dogs. The books which fall into this green overlapping area are the books that mention both cats and dogs. So based on how you connect the search term dogs and the search term cats, it's going to determine how many books you get out of the blue circle only, the yellow circle only, or the overlapping area. If you connect dogs and cats with the word and, dogs and cats, what you're saying is, I would like to find books that mention dogs and that mention cats. You're saying you only want to find books that mention both of those topics. So for this search, you would receive back only the books in this green overlapping area of the two circles. This is a significantly smaller number of items than those included by both of these total circles. So the books that mention both dogs and cats is a smaller number of books than all the books which mention either cats or dogs. So moving down, now let's pretend that the blue circle is all the books about cats, while the yellow circle is all of the books about felines. Now, you probably are aware that cat and feline are synonyms. In other words, two different words that you could use to describe the same basic idea. But some people that write a book about cats might use the word cat in the title, while someone else uses the word feline in the title. Now, what you need to remember when you're searching, especially the library catalog, is that you're not searching every single word in the whole book. You're only searching a very, very small amount of information, such as the title, author, publisher, possibly the titles of the chapters from the table of contents, but possibly not, possibly a one-paragraph summary, but possibly not, and then that list of subject tags at the bottom that we saw at the bottom of the page in the first video. So you have to remember that even if both the word cat and the word feline appear somewhere in the book, they may not both appear in the information that you're searching in the catalog. So when you're brainstorming about what kinds of words you might search for, you want to be thinking about synonyms like this. Synonyms are a good example of where we connect search words with the word or. When you search for cats or felines, you're indicating that you'd like to find any books that use either of those words, but the book does not have to use both words. So you will find not only the items here in the middle that use both, you will also find all the items in the blue circle and all the items in the yellow circle. So this will get you a very large number of results compared to, for instance, if you did cats and felines because you wanted to find only the books that used both words. Cats or felines will get you all of this. This is a little bit of a silly mnemonic device, but if it helps you remember, just tell yourself that or gets you more, while and gets you less as the opposite. Now there are ways that you can use or other than with synonyms. If you're interested in multiple ideas, for instance, perhaps you're interested in the effect of the Vietnam War on both women and children. Well, if you're interested in either women or children, this might be an instance where you could put the Vietnam War and women or children, which wouldn't be synonyms, it would just be multiple ideas that are of equal interest to your topic. So how you use it will really depend on what you're researching. But generally, the use of or with synonyms is the most common way that you're going to see it. Now keep in mind, this is not only synonyms that would be both words we would use today. You also want to think about synonyms in terms of modern versus historical language. As an example, African Americans is a common standard term for a group of people today. But African Americans is not a term that has been used in all periods of American history. If you were searching through, say, 18th century documents and you only searched for the term African Americans, you're not going to find anything because that term didn't exist yet. So you need to think about what sort of language was being used at the time and link those sorts of modern and historical synonyms with or. So for instance, you might search for African Americans and Negroes, or African Americans or blacks, or similar combinations of modern and historical terms. And or are the two most common ways that you will combine words in your searches to get fewer or more results. But there is one more common way to combine terms. Let's look at this. You won't use this one very often, but when you hit the time where you need it, you will suddenly be very glad that you know about it. And this is the word not. Let's say that you're writing a paper about dolphins, the animal. But every time you search for dolphins, you find some things about the animals, and you get back some things about the Miami Dolphins football team. By putting in the search dolphins, not football, you're telling the catalog that you'd like to find everything in this blue circle. Then you want to throw away everything in the green overlapping area. So what you're left with is just the blue part all by itself. So it gets you a smaller amount than what you would have gotten with the blue circle and the overlapping green area. This is a great way to omit irrelevant materials that you can identify by another key word. Like I said, you won't use this nearly as much as and or, but it'll be handy on those rare occasions when you suddenly discover that you need it. So that's a very brief introduction to putting together search terms. I will draw your attention to the fact that this can get far more complicated. For instance, you could say that you want the Vietnam War and African Americans or blacks. This should almost be looking like something that you would see in a math class, where you get parentheses to separate two things that are being subtracted before you add it to something else. Searching can become very mathematical when you get very complex with adding terms together, but you don't have to get that complicated from the beginning. One more tip: anytime you're searching for a phrase that consists of more than one word, for instance, Vietnam War or African Americans, it can be very helpful to put that phrase inside of quotation marks. Why? Well, in some search interfaces it won't make a difference, but in some it will. When you type simply the two words African and Americans, that's how it reads it. It reads it as African and Americans. It's simply looking for both words, but not necessarily both words appearing right next to each other in that order. So it might find African on page 5 and Americans on page 50, and they're not particularly related to each other in context. When you search for African Americans in quotes, you're saying, I only want to find these two words when they appear right next to each other in this order. So it makes your search much more specific. Now there's a lot more to know about this. Proximity operators is something that some of you may eventually have to learn about if you're doing research topics that are complex to describe with certain words. But we won't worry about those things right now. You can always ask your professor or the history librarian for more help if you need to put together complicated searches. For now, this brief introduction should help you understand how to put words together with and, or, and not to make your search larger or smaller, broader or narrower, depending on what it is you need to find.